Welcome to the PetroPapers podcast. Say that 10 times fast. This is where you get your oil and gas intellectual stimulation by asking the technical questions. I'm Yoga Shri Pradhan, and with me here today, I have Diego Molinari. Today, we're going to discuss paper 5023 from URTEC, and the paper description and the paper title is in our podcast description, as well as our YouTube description for our viewers and listeners. I'm going to talk a little bit about Diego before we start peppering him with questions. He's a reservoir engineer with broad and diversified international experience in the oil and gas industry, known for successfully combining classical petroleum engineering methods and data analytics, machine learning to characterize and predict reservoir and well performance, with hands-on expertise in exploration, appraisal, and field development. He's a technology enthusiast with proven record of designing and implementing value-driven workflows through digital technologies using agile Scrum practices, both in corporate and commercial contexts. His main skill sets and areas of expertise are data analytics, physics-based reservoir modeling, digital oil field, PTA and RTA, production forecasting, nodal analysis and multiphase flow in wellbores and pipes, Python scientific development, and agile project ownership and management. He's fluent in 3 languages, which is English, Spanish, and Italian. Welcome to the podcast, Diego.
Yeah, thank you, Yoshi. Thanks for the invite. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, just to start us off, to orient our viewers and listeners, could you talk a little bit about what 5023 or what the paper is about?
Yes. I mean, actually, this paper is not the first time we publish about this work. Actually, I mean, if you're really interested in this topic, the first paper was published in 2019, URTEC 2019-41. And then there is another one also from 2019, 196122. So this paper is actually a successor paper to those 2 publications. But, basically speaking, it's about developing a methodology to model well performance in unconventional in a very repeatable and scalable way. Because, the problem in unconventional is that, there's been an effort in the last, decade and a half to model production, but it's not very repeatable, So for example, numerical simulation, I mean, there is a lot of work in developing robust simulators, but typically the pace of development in unconventional is very fast. And, a typical company, in the good times will drill hundreds of wells a year, depending on your size of the company. And simulation may not be able to catch up with that fast pace of development. And then, I mean, even methods like RTA, that's kind of the premise, right? That maybe it's going to be faster and you can interpret more wells, but they're kind of playing with assumptions, right? And they're highly non-unique. And you need to know a lot of stuff like the permeability and the porosity. And I mean, some of these properties, like how many fractures you actually have in your well, and represent all the properties of these fractures. And these properties are highly speculative.
Yes.
Often, I mean, even like permeability, it's very difficult to really understand the value of permeability, and depending how you measure it, you have orders of magnitude of error, for uncertainty. So our approach was like, can we analyze these wells with the minimum set of assumptions, least assumptions that we can, and make it repeatable and consistent, okay? So this methodology is heavily based on the research work done in Texas A&M by MCRI, which is a consortium led by Dr. Akhil, Datta-Gupta, and Mike King. And we're basically taking that foundational research that their team is doing, and we kind of adapted it and tested it with thousands of wells and made it more practical, that we can actually use it with real, noisy, dirty data to basically understand the well performance through PI. So one of the key premises of our approach is that calculating a representative productivity index that really represents the well potential, normalizing by any operating conditions. Like, for example, regardless of where the well is on the production life cycle, if you're in natural flow or gas lift or a rod pump, regardless of your choke opening, regardless of downtime, can you capture the true characteristics of the well potential, the production potential? Because the other alternative is to do decline curve analysis.
Right.
And decline curve analysis is indeed the most commonplace method for research and budgets and forecasting, and it's good. I mean, it's very repeatable and people can understand it. But the problem with decline curve analysis, it only uses rates, and by not using the pressure, you're missing the other half of the coin that is really important. So with this methodology, we wanted to incorporate both rate and pressure with the agility of decline curve analysis that you can make a field-wide implementation. And I mean, we can get more in details, but I think in a nutshell, that is the motivation. It's a repeatable, scalable, well-performance methodology that you can actually use in real data,
Awesome. Thanks for that clarification.
Yeah.
Well, in the paper, you talk about incorporating diffusive time of flight. So for our viewers and listeners, especially if they haven't been engrossed in Dr. Akhil Datta-Gupta's research, what is diffusive time of flight?
Well, basically, diffusive time of flight is actually kind of a dimensional calculation, and it's coming more from traditional fields like streamlines. And in fact, I know Dr. Datta-Gupta has a lot of history, like publishing papers on streamlines. They've done a lot of work recently on the fast marching method. But, typically, a lot of these formulations depend on having an Earth model. Like you need to have a previous distribution of properties, and then depending on your permeability, heterogeneity, you calculate this diffusive time of flight. I guess the best way to explain it in layman terms, how in well testing, we talk about investigation radius? Yes. An investigation radius, you have a vertical well and homogeneous formation, and you're propagating your pressure disturbance radially outside from the well. What you're trying to do with diffusive time of flight is to represent the propagation of the pressure front in a heterogeneous system. That heterogeneity can be due to the rock properties, but it also can be due to the hydraulic fractures like we have in unconventionals, where the system is quite complex. But the idea is that what diffusive time of flight is gonna track is a contour of how far your pressure disturbance is traveling in your reservoir. And I think the novelty of this method is that you can do that without any underlying Earth model, but purely based on the pressure and production history that you're capturing on the well. And in the mathematical formulation, and I actually recommend that paper published by Texas A&M. This is a paper from 2016 in the Journal of Petroleum Science and Engineering from Changdong, Vishal, Sharma, Akhil Datta-Gupta, and Mike Keane. It's called Novel Approach for Production Transient Analysis of Shale Reservoir Using the Drainage Volume Derivative. That is the paper that actually goes through the whole mathematical formulation in detail of how you reach to these expressions. But the beauty is that you're making very minimal assumptions, which I mean, you don't assume a permeability, you don't assume any fracture system. I think the only key assumption is the compressibility. So you do need to estimate the total compressibility of the system, including the formation and the fluids. But with that, just by having the rates and the bottom hole pressure, mathematically it can be demonstrated that you can track the evolution of this pressure front, which correlates to the drainage volume of the well. Awesome.
And for our viewers and listeners, the papers that you have already mentioned that you've referenced, especially with the predecessor papers for 50323 and for the Dr. Akhil Datta-Gupta's research, the 2016 paper that you mentioned, all of that will be in our paper citations in the description. So thank you for mentioning all of those.
Absolutely.
Now I want to get a little bit into the details of the paper, because I've been thinking a lot about frac hits and fracture to fracture interference and net system losses. So there can be net system losses due to frac interference. You mentioned material balance and a combination of diffusive time of flight. Is that still valid, and why?
Well, I think when we talk about interference, we have to differentiate between different types of interference. So, wells may be interfering in a soft way when they're kind of coming online at the same time, typical campaign development, right? You're bringing wells at a given spacing. And you know that these wells are gonna interfere with each other as they start expanding their drainage volumes, right? And they may go into like pseudo boundary dominated flow, but it's a very soft interference because it's not a frac hit, right? They're just depleting together. And I think, even if you're doing like traditional RTA, the approach has been always to model each well independently. And I think there is a mathematical abstraction that you kind of assume that there is an outflow boundary between the wells, and each well is going to drain from its own pool. And I think even if you have some interference through your fractures, you may still not completely contact your full volume in the matrix, because the matrix transient diffusion is very slow. So you see, as long as the interference is slow interference when the wells are producing at the same time and they're kind of co-developed in a campaign, I think the methodology is okay, because we're basically assuming a tank.
Yes.
And that tank is not a constant tank. The tank keeps increasing, but you're basically going to naturally split or allocate the drainage between neighbor wells, and that will be reflected in the data. So I think that the material balance methodology is going to capture that, because we're just basically inferring the size of that tank, okay? Now, where we are going to have some problem is when you have a frac hit, because that is more like a fast interference, and the parent well is going to be changed by receiving the heat. And we have seen it many times, right? You have an increase in water cut, but sometimes the well never recovers. And likewise, I've seen scenarios when the parent well gets better. So I mean, there are all these complex interactions when fast interference is going to change the character of the well. And I don't think you can use the formulation anymore. Like, in fact, one of the key limitations, and I think we talk about this in the first paper,
yes,
this methodology, you can only use it when the well has not been hit. And we have been speculating a lot, like what happens when the well gets hit. And ideally, you will then model a new segment. So it's almost like you have to reset your model after the hit. The tricky thing is that understanding the initial pressure and the characteristics of that second tank is not straightforward. I actually think that the Texas A&M group this is something that it's in their to-do list for research, but I don't think there is yet a satisfactory solution for frac hits, to be honest. That's still a work in progress.
Thank you for that clarification. And yeah, I've been thinking a lot about frac hits and how the combination of diffusive time of flight and material balance can still be applied. Well,
so just to clarify on that, what I will do in the past is I will still analyze the well,
okay,
until the moment of the hit. And if you have a parent well that has been hit after 2 years, you still have sufficient data to understand the impact of that completion design. So it also depends how late in the game the hit happens, because if you're able to capture a lot of the early time in history, you may still have enough data to fully characterize the influence of that well. But you may not be able to do a forecast. That's pretty much the caveat.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Yeah.
I wanted to pivot a little bit in the algorithm to calculate drainage volume and average reservoir depletion.
Yeah.
How do you classify what is an outlier?
Well, the challenge is that if you look at the expression for the drainage volume, it's a derivative, okay? It's basically you're calculating the pressure normalized rate, and then versus material balance time, and that derivative is correlated to the drainage volume. The problem is that if you try to derive the real data,
yeah,
I mean, the funny thing, Yoshi, when you look at the academic work, they always use like synthetic examples and everything is clean and everything is quite controlled. But when you're trying to use this methodology in real wells, they're noisy, they're dirty. You can see a lot of unexpected artifacts on the data. So it's very important that when you plot the pressure normalized rate versus material balance time, it's monotonically declining or monotonically decreasing. If you have noise and your data points are going up and down, that derivative is going to be extremely unstable. So I think the crucial thing is how can we estimate a derivative that is stable, that captures the key shape of the data without being affected by all this noise. And honestly, I think there are different approaches of how to do it. What we decided to do is to smooth the data using actually a hyperbolic relationship. Maybe a criticism is like, are you abusing the hyperbolic? But honestly, I mean, the more I look at data and I look at multiple basins, oil basins, gas basins, even when you do rate normalized pressure rather than just rate, a hyperbolic feed tends to capture the shape pretty well. But of course, if you have the data artifacts where the points are deviating from that trend, you're basically smoothing that trend based on your feed so that you can get a more stable derivative. If you don't want to assume anything parametric, I think you could do something more data-driven, like a median filter, like a Savitsky-Golay filter, so there may be other ways, but I think the key way is to make sure that the data is monotonically decreasing, so when you calculate the derivative is stable and you can actually estimate an increase in drainage volume. Because if you don't do that, your drainage volume is going to go down. It's going to be extremely unstable because of that derivative effect, okay? The other thing, you're talking about outliers. You have to be very careful with your allocations because, you know, often we are not always lucky to have production, you know, measured for every single well. So if you have allocations, you have to be really careful when maybe the rate is misleading. So there is a lot of quality control. And then even on the pressure, because, you know, the challenge, and people don't talk about this very often, you have daily data, okay? And your production data is not an instantaneous measurement. You're basically representing an average on a day. What about your pressure? Your pressure is an instantaneous measurement because typically you're pulling tubing or casing pressure, you know, every minute or given high resolution. And there is a value that gets carried in the production accounting system, but that daily value is not always consistent with the instantaneous pressure with the average production for that day. So if you have days that we're experiencing downtime, and I'm not talking about the well being down 24 hours, but maybe you had 3 hours downtime, 4 hours downtime, the operating conditions of that well were not stable. The correspondence of pressure and rate data on a daily basis may be quite biased. So I think you have to be very careful with that kind of stuff. Another thing you may want to be careful, what happens if you were changing chokes and choke was not stable. So what we've done in the past is that maybe periods where the choke is changing a lot, you kind of do not feed those points, or maybe you de-emphasize those points, while when the well was stable, you provide more weight to those points. So, I mean, I don't want to give a cookie cutter recipe because I think every company and every field has different situations with the data. But I think in terms of outliers, you got to make sure that your data is consistent, your production allocation is okay, the pressure and production data are, you know, reflecting each other trends. And when you have unstable conditions like changing the choke or downtime, make sure that you're actually incorporating data that is valid. Okay, so I would say those are the key criteria for outliers.
Awesome. Thank you for that clarification too. I wanted to pivot a little bit onto the PI forecast. Can you still forecast liquid PI for near critical reservoirs, such as retrograde condensate kind of reservoirs?
So that's a very interesting question. And let me backtrack a little bit to explain the motivation of the PI. And I'll get to the answer, I promise, but I want to give some context, you know. So, you know, the whole motivation of using PI for forecasting, number one, as I was explaining before, is to incorporate the pressure, because oftentimes when we use decline curve analysis, we are not capturing how the well is actually being operated, how the well is actually being produced, okay? And there are situations when the rate is flat, or the rate is actually increasing because maybe the well is subjected to heavy constraints, or, you know, facility constraints, etc. So, you know, by incorporating the pressure, you can detect a much more robust decline. Now, the challenge with multiphase, because I think your question relates to multiphase, and even if you're not near the critical point, you still have a multiphase problem. Yes. Because you're still producing, you know, oil, gas, and water. And that is not a problem specific to our methodology, because any analytical method is going to suffer the same problem, right? If you look at RTA, these techniques are often single phase, and you're trying to represent a multi-phase system, and the only way to do that robustly is through a numerical model, using, you know, relative permeability curves and using an explicit multi-phase model. But we want to move away from that in analytical models. The idea is to reduce the physics and, you know, make it more repeatable. So we use the Perrin-Martin method. I think that's in the paper.
Yes.
Because the methodology is single phase, right? And you cannot get away from that. But the approximation is that we're going to recombine the phases into a total equivalent single phase that represents the total flow stream in the reservoir, okay? And that, I think, works pretty well for oil systems, because this Perrin approximation is actually very popular in PTA, and you're actually measuring your, even if your GOR is increasing, when you recombine the phases downhole, as long as you have a good PVT, you can actually recombine them in a total equivalent stream that is representative. And you can also do it for gas. Now, for gas, there are different ways to do it, because the water, you can assume that the water is a separate liquid stream in the reservoir, or you can assume that the water is in the vapor phase on the gas. So I think on the gas, it's a little bit tricky because you need to characterize the water properly. Yes. Now, the problem when you are close to the critical point is the retrograde condensation. Because, when you recombine the fluids, you cannot account for the liquids that are lost to the formation that you never recover back. So I think that you can still use the methodology, but the caveat is that your retrograde condensation phenomena is not actually explicitly modeled. Okay. So your PI is basically going to reflect the fluid that is being produced at the wellhead, but it will actually neglect the volume that is being condensed in a retrograde way in the reservoir. The formulation does not accommodate for that. Having said that, it's still potentially useful to compare wells with each other. Yes. But that may add a little bit more uncertainty on the estimates of depletion. Yes. Okay. Near critical fluids are very challenging, and the elephant in the room that is actually tough is also the PVT, because when in this formulation you assume that you understand your PVT properties, and with near critical fluids, do we really understand the PVT that well? So I think it will depend on having a really strong PVT understanding. Yes, PVT is extremely important. Have you managed to forecast gas, especially in some wells where gas keeps increasing or it has a shallow decline? Are you talking about dry gas or primarily gas reservoirs, or are you talking about oil reservoir or oil wells where the GOR keeps changing? The oil reservoirs where the GOR keeps changing. Yeah, that is one of the most difficult problems to solve. And actually, when we were working on this method, I think we read your paper. I think you have a paper from like 2 or 3 years ago, which is very interesting about how GOR profiles are changing depending on the operational strategy. So when we published this paper, we were attempting to solve this problem mathematically. And the approach we present in the paper is very simple. We're basically just assuming 2 segments. It's kind of a material balance approach. And the idea is that you can represent, kind of a flat GOR when you are above the bubble point, and then you cross the bubble point and you're having a power law behavior that can be basically seen in a log-log plot of cum gas versus cum oil. And due to that power law behavior in a log-log plot, you can represent a reasonable shape of the GOR. I think that power law model works decently if the well is not changing conditions suddenly. What I'm trying to say with that, you're smoothly declining your well, you're going below the bubble point, but your drawdown is not changing that aggressively. And I think you can use that method with a power law and it's okay. The problem is when you start, for example, say you open your choke and then maybe you install an ESP and then maybe you go to gas lift or rod pump. So when you have very distinct changes in the life of the well, that can have a dramatic influence on the drawdown. Yes. Your GOR profile is not going to be so smooth, and you need to make it a more robust way where actually your GOR forecast also has to have some pressure intelligence. It needs to be dependent on your pressure. The paper that we are discussing in this podcast really doesn't address that problem, but I don't think that, our solution is very modular. So what I'm trying to say, even if you characterize the drainage volume and the liquid PI the GOR forecast or the gas forecasting is a separate component. We actually formulate it as representing not the gas, but the GOR, the shape of the GOR. And you can keep the methodology intact. And then you can replace the methodology or the model of how you forecast the GOR, but nothing else on the rest of the methodology actually changes. So that's what I mean, it's modular because you can still use the same formulation and just change how you forecast that GOR. I do gotta say that, you know, my co-author, Sathish Sankaran, and his team at Zeta, I know that they are actively working on developing much more robust ways to forecast the GOR, but I don't think that work has been published yet or it's not in the public domain, so I may not be able to comment more about that. But I mean, I know this is a very active field of research, and it's one of the toughest problems in the industry right now because, you know, even if you're doing decline curve analysis, most companies are struggling or capturing the gas forecast properly. It's a very complex phenomenon, and it's dependent on your drawdown, it's depending on your spacing, it's depending on your artificial lift. So it's a tricky problem. And I think our approach was an initial attempt, but it's definitely something that requires more investigation.
Thank you. Yes, that is a conundrum that I've been thinking a lot about, and that's how that paper came out to be, that the paper that you mentioned that I wrote.
Yeah.
So the other question that I had, another conundrum that I've been thinking about, is the amount of completion water. So have you ever taken into account the completion water for that water rate forecast, and how has that impacted the material balance?
So it's a very interesting problem because, you know, you can be, for example, in the Permian, and the Permian makes a lot of water. Like actually the first field where we applied this methodology was in the Delaware Basin. And, you know, it's very common that you have 3-to-1, 5-to-1 ratios of water to oil.
Yes.
So in this case, it kind of matters, but not so much, the frac water, because at the end of the day, you're still going to produce more than 100% of the water that you actually injected when fracking the well. But then you go to the Haynesville, which is like desiccated, and there is no movable interstitial water, and the water you're getting back is actually water from frac, as you're saying, from the completion. I think from a material balance perspective, it doesn't really matter when the water is coming from, because, you know, we're basically assuming a tank, okay?
Yes.
And it's a, you know, I always kind of explain people that there are some advantages of using this formulation, but there are also some disadvantages because, you know, we are estimating the size of the tank, but we don't tell you the shape. So, you know, often people ask me, oh, is the water coming from layer 1 or layer 2 or layer 3? And it's like, I don't know. This methodology is not going to answer that. You're just basically lumping all that volume together for oil, I mean, for hydrocarbon and also for water. And honestly, yeah, that is a combination of frac water and formation water. You know, it's going to be both. In the paper, there is a parameter that we call omega. Yes. And that omega is basically the ratio between the in-place volume of water and the in-place volume of hydrocarbon. And I think in the paper, we do suggest using the saturations, like some petrophysical information, to estimate omega. But to your point, that formulation doesn't incorporate the frac water. There is another formulation, actually not in the paper because we kind of developed it a bit later, but that omega, you can estimate it from the data. And the idea is that you know, you can estimate from the proportion of water and hydrocarbon that you're producing at any moment in time, the relative size of the in-place water and the in-place oil or hydrocarbon in your system. And that omega is actually changing, right? Because even if you're propagating different in the water saturated layers versus the oil saturated layers, or for example, if the formation is desiccated, you're only producing frac water, then your hydrocarbon is going to be contacted more. You can actually, from a data-driven perspective, estimate that omega as a function of time. And I think that abstraction will solve this problem. But I think what the methodology cannot answer is how much of the water is coming from the reservoir and how much is coming from the frac. It just kind of lumps everything together in one mathematical abstraction, which is a tank, you know.
Okay.
And as long as that water is being produced, I think the formulation works because it's just purely based on material balance. I mean, how much water you're making out and deriving how much it's in place, you know.
Got it. So that will also include the completion water. Okay.
Right.
Well, I've peppered you with plenty of questions, but there's one question that I don't want
Yeah.
to let you go with. What are some applications to this workflow that is mentioned in the paper that we haven't seen before in this industry?
Well, actually, there is another paper that I think is coming up in IPTC. IPTC, I think it's actually in these days. I mean, it should be soon in Saudi Arabia. And actually, my co-author, Sathish Sankaran, he's the main author of that paper. I'm kind of a co-author, but this actually has a lot of applications on production optimization. So, when you talk about, PI and forecasting, everybody thinks about reservoir. Like,
Yep.
okay, let's predict the future performance and let's understand what's driving the well productivity. But actually, production engineers often make decisions using like rule of thumbs and it's very difficult, right? A typical production engineer in unconventional has hundreds of wells under their watch, and it's very difficult to scientifically optimize in a very systematic way every well. Often there is a recipe, like, oh, we're going to install gas lifts after 6 months, or we're going to open the chokes, or we're going to install plungers. You see what I mean? But it's very cookie cutter, a one-size-fits-all approach, just because it's very difficult to repeat the analysis at scale, right? You cannot do nodal analysis at scale for every well. I think nobody has done it.
Yeah.
And I think with this methodology, you actually can, because by having that PI representation, you can convert it into an IPR. And I think we talk about that in the paper. And if you can now generate IPRs, the historical evolution of the IPR, but also you can project how the IPR is going to be, you can start understanding the full well life cycle production management. Like, for example, when should I install artificial lift? When should I transition from one artificial lift method to another? And even if, let's say you're working only with rod pumps or ESPs or gas lift optimization. Like, how can I extract the maximum amount of barrels with the equipment I have in place? Because now you have a methodology that is pressure sensitive.
Yes.
So when you are in DCA, I can provide the best, prediction of the rate, but you cannot estimate with decline analysis how is the decline changing if I accelerate my drawdown, if I change my, my natural flow and I install an ESP. And you will have to make a lot of assumptions about the B factor and decline shape, but it's all very heuristical, Now, by having a methodology that reacts to pressure, by generating an IPR and then combining that with the VLP, which we can do as a nodal analysis, we have all the ingredients in place. You can start assessing, okay, I'm going to put an ESP and it's going to operate at this frequency and it's going to operate, it's going to be this type of equipment with this type of design. And you can actually have a very quantitative, repeatable estimate of the production impact you're going to have. So, it's a very complex phenomenon, because it's, you have to really understand your production system. But I think we have all the ingredients in place to make that happen. And it's very exciting because, at the end of the day, that translates into barrels, that translates into value very directly,
Awesome.
And, if I can say, Joshi, that's been one of my eye-openers from this approach, is kind of getting married the reservoir and production domains. Because, at the end of the day, it's the same well, it's the same reservoir, we're still trying to work with the same system. And I think as we generate a forecast, as we characterize the system, we have to tie with production engineering, with how we are operating the well, and we can close the loop, And that way, it's a much more effective management of your assets,
Awesome. Well, that's very exciting to hear. Diego, thank you so much for taking the time to letting me pepper you with questions on this podcast.
Thank you. Anytime. It's a pleasure to be here. And thanks for your audience too. I appreciate your interest in this topic.
Awesome. Well, you heard it straight from Diego of all the questions that I peppered him with. I am Yogashri Pradhan, and I feel free to reach out to me for any feedback or anyone else I can pepper with questions with any of the SPE papers. And I'm signing off.